Welcome to the November webinar presented by SPSP and sponsored by Sedgwick Brand Protection. We thank Sedgwick for their um, assistance with these programs. They will be doing the same next year. We thank them again. My name is Ken Ross. I am the SPSP webinar coordinator. And I'll also participate speaking today because this is an area that I've had a lot of experience with. But let me first show you the programs we've got coming up. In December, customer service and call center operations. And we've talked about this a little bit before. We'll focus the whole hour on it. This is so important because this is the first time safety issues arise usually, and what do we do about them, and can we do things so we don't miss safety problems or not overstate them or understate them or something like that. So that's important. In January, we're going to talk about customer education programs. Speakers will be people who have done these things before. And in February, I've got both a regulatory and a lawyer and litigator to talk about recall litigation. And this is something that is growing, both litigation where the adequacy of your recall is questioned, and secondly, class actions are being filed on behalf of consumers for the remedy that's provided by the litigation or that no recall has been undertaken. In March, we're going to talk about the new general product safety regulations, technical documentation requirements. Now, these are very detailed. They're very, very different than anything in the US. And if you're selling in the EU, you need to know about these things. They're now effective, and you need to comply with them. Our speakers today, first Griffen Thorne, who's a partner at Lewis Brisbois, and Griffen is not a product safety lawyer, but he is an M&A lawyer, mergers and acquisitions lawyer, and he is going to talk about the ways in which we buy and sell businesses. Mark Hickok, our veteran product safety professional, from Milwaukee Tool, and Mark is going to talk about his experiences and his company in evaluating purchases and sales of companies that they buy and sell. Now, I'm also going to talk, and over my years, I was an in-house lawyer for a number of years, and my company bought and sold a lot of businesses, and we had all kinds of problems. Whichever side we were on. So I'm going to talk about my personal experiences there. So this is a very important topic because you can buy a big problem. And historically, there have been a bunch of companies who probably should know better, who've bought business entities or product lines and have wound up with huge product safety problems, either having to recall a product right after they bought the division or business, or have a bunch of product liability cases that they're responsible for. And even on the selling side, even when you sell a business, and I've had this experience, I sold the business and I had to keep the product liability, and the way we sold the business made it extremely difficult to defend the lawsuits. So it was on either side, and we'll try to focus on both sides of it here. It's very important. So with that, let me turn it over to Griffen.
Thanks for the introduction, Ken, and thanks everyone for watching, and my co-panelist Mark as well. As Ken mentioned, I'm an attorney with Lewis Brisbois in Los Angeles. I'm a member of our firm's corporate team, where I do a lot of M&A transactions. M&A, by the way, means mergers and acquisitions. A merger is basically a combination of multiple business, whereas an acquisition is acquiring another business. I'm not going to be talking about mergers today. It's sort of a complicated issue, and it really is outside the scope of this webinar. I'm going to focus more of my discussion on acquisitions, basically just because they're simpler. I do much more acquisition work, and it's what you're going to see in your average small and medium-sized enterprise transaction. So I want to go through what these deals are, what they look like, how they're structured, and then the typical liability issues that might arise. And this, I should say, is general to any acquisition transaction for the most part. It doesn't have to deal with product, businesses that manufacture or sell products. It could be a purely services-oriented business. The general topics I'm going to discuss today relate basically to the whole. So, Ken, why don't you advance the slide by one, please? All right, so the first thing I want to do right now is just get out some basic terms. I'm not sure how familiar all the attendees are with high-level corporate details and how these businesses are set up, but it's important to understand what the entity structure actually looks like to understand the acquisition. And so I've used as an example, and I will use as an example throughout these slides, a corporation. Historically, a corporation is the most popular business form. You really could do the same analysis with other types of entities like a limited liability company, LLC, limited partnership, or others, right? It's in general, it's the same structure. So you have a company, in this case, a corporation. I have it as the yellow block in the middle of the screen. A corporation is formed by individuals by making a filing with the Secretary of State in whatever state they want to operate. And when you form a corporation, the owners of the corporation, who are called stockholders or shareholders, receive what's called limited liability protection. This is a hallmark of corporate law. You might have heard of it referred to as corporate personhood. And the most simple way to explain this, I think, is an example I learned back in law school. Kids opening a lemonade stand, they will have to buy the lemons and the water and the sugar and the table and all that stuff. They buy it with their own money. They go out on the side of the street. They sell lemonade to someone. Now, if someone gets sick from the lemonade and wants to sue, those kids or their parents get sued as an individual. If they, however, they go and form a corporation, well, the corporation will buy the lemonade and all the tools and devices and whatnot. And if someone wants to sue, the kids' parents aren't going to get sued personally. The corporation's going to get sued. Of course, there's some exceptions, as there always is in the law, where people can go past the corporation and look at the shareholders. But again, outside the scope of this discussion. So basically, for the purposes of today, you form a corporation or other entity type. It exists as a legal person, meaning it can own property, it can sue, it can be sued in its own name, so on and so forth. So back to the corporate structure, shareholders own what's called shares, or shares of stock. They're represented by a piece of paper called a stock certificate. More often nowadays for smaller companies, it's actually just an electronic record, but historically you'd have a paper certificate. And the total percentage of the business you owned would be represented by taking the number of shares you own and dividing them by the number of total shares outstanding. So, if I own 10 shares out of 100, I own 10% of the business. On the other side of the corporation, remember I said it's considered a legal person, so it can own property and have liabilities. It will own its own assets and own its own liabilities. On the asset side, it includes basically anything, right? So real estate is a common asset. A lot of businesses don't own real estate, so they lease it, but they'll own things like machinery, tooling, equipment, inventory, work in process goods, raw materials, all the sort of physical assets it would take to go into a business and that manufactures products or whatever. They would also own money-related assets, so think of cash, the deposit accounts that the company might have. They might own stock in other companies. They might have accounts payable, or accounts receivable rights, the rights to receive money, and then sort of intangible rights that we think of, rights under contracts, intellectual property, so patents, trademarks, copyrights, social media accounts, websites, all that stuff. All that fits within the general basket of assets that a company might own. On the liability side, these are things like tax obligations, obligations under contracts, so rent, for example, insurance payments, payments to employees, payments to contractors, other types of governmental payments like permit and license payments. If there's ongoing litigation, that's the liability. If there's a judgment, if litigation resulted in a judgment against the company, that's a liability. Debt the company might owe. So that's all the liability side. Now, all of these are factors that a buyer is going to take into consideration when it's evaluating whether or not to buy a business, because obviously liabilities play a massive concern. So with the basics behind us, I'd like to turn to the next slide if Ken can do that. Thanks, Ken. So the first major form of acquisition type I'll talk about is just the business acquisition. And when we say business acquisition, we really mean the stock acquisition. So I have the corporate structure from my prior slide. And as you can see, there's a red line across the top. And that just represents the level at which the transaction takes place. So in the business acquisition structure, the buyer will go to all, or in some cases, just some of the stockholders and buy out their stock. So the sellers in this transaction are the stockholders themselves. And when the buyer acquires all or most of the stock, it becomes the owner or the majority owner of the corporation. From the seller's perspective, this is great because they get paid, they get to go to a beach somewhere, have a nice vacation, and they're done. From the buyer side, the problem with the stock sale and stock purchase is that you are buying a company which still has all of its assets, but it still has all of its liabilities. So you effectively inherit a company with liabilities. Now, the owners of that company are still protected by virtue of limited liability in general from being sued by a creditor of the corporation, but the corporation is still on the hook for all of its own liabilities. So I'll give an example of something I've seen in the past. We had a client buy a business. There were substantial issues with the lease, which were not disclosed by the sellers, of course. So the client personally didn't have he wasn't going to get sued, but the company he acquired had to pay those claims. And so by extension, he indirectly did. So those are the contexts in which, as a buyer, you're very hesitant to walk into a stock sale where you have to inherit effectively all of the liabilities. And the biggest problem from any buyer's perspective, frankly, is just the fact that liabilities might not be fully disclosed. Whether or not the seller, purposely tries to hide something from the buyer, or just doesn't know about something, or made a mistake in not disclosing it. Once the deal closes, I like to tell people, just assume the sellers are going to disappear and you'll have no recourse against them. You'll never see them again, and that money is gone. So in that case, do you want to be stuck with a business that might have liabilities? And this is another reason why when you're doing a business sale or business acquisition, it's very important to leave no stone unturned and do proper and very thorough due diligence. It's almost always a very bad idea to try to rush through closing on a stock sale because you just might not find something. So as you can imagine, these are generally, from a buyer's side, disfavored. I would say most of the time, if not, like the vast majority of cases in small and mid-sized acquisitions are set up as asset sales these days, in my experience. There are some reasons why you might have to do it as a business acquisition. For example, if the company, the target entity, has licenses that can't be transferred, well, there's no other choice, right? That license is personal to the entity. For me, that comes up a lot. I do a lot of acquisitions in the cannabis industry, and in California, the license is personal to the business. It can't be transferred. So there is no other choice. You have to buy the stock of those entities. But in a non-regulated entity where there's no licenses at play, the vast majority of borrowers are going to insist on not going with this structure. So what's the alternative structure? Ken, would you mind flipping the page? Okay, so in this case is the asset acquisition structure. And unlike a business sale, as you can see, the red line is at the bottom. The seller in an asset sale is the company itself. So the stockholders don't sell anything. The company sells the buyer its assets. There's effective. I mean, there's two kinds of asset sales, right? You're either buying all of the company's assets and or you're buying fixed assets, specific assets. In the case of, we're talking to product safety professionals, that might be a product line or multiple product lines. Or in other cases, it might just be certain intellectual property. It really depends on the situation. But those are really the two main types of asset acquisition. And obviously, if you're doing an asset acquisition where you're buying 100% of the assets, the selling entity, the corporation here, is going to wind down and cease doing business. Sellers usually don't like this structure because they have to deal with the cleanup after the sale is conducted, right? They have to deal with the liabilities and wind down the corporation and then distribute any money that's left, as opposed to the stock sale where they just get paid and that's it. You can see some dotted lines here, and the purpose of those is to highlight the fact that if you're the buyer in an asset transaction, this is why most people prefer to do the asset transaction, you can specify, I'm only buying certain assets or maybe all of the assets. I'm not inheriting any liabilities, right? And so the first dotted line shows that, in many cases, the buyer will just say, I'm buying the assets. I'm not assuming any liabilities. In other cases, there might be negotiations where certain liabilities are assumed. So certain contractual obligations of the selling company might be assumed by the buyer on a go-forward basis. A common occurrence is that the buyer will step into the lease of the seller entity. So if there's a physical location, they might say, I'll take over the lease. In some cases, there might be some back rent. They have to negotiate that with the landlord. So in most deals, there's some sort of liabilities that are inherited, but it's almost never going to be the entirety of the liabilities. I don't think I've ever seen that, because why not just do a stock sale at that point, right? So this is, from a buyer's perspective, leagues more favorable to handle it as an asset sale. And in an asset sale, like I said, if you're going to structure it in a way that you're looking only at, let's say, a product line, you can set it up very minimally. It's not even, the risks are much different. So you might buy the intellectual property, the branding, the patent that's necessary to produce the product. You might buy the tooling, specialized tooling and machinery. You might buy items of inventory that are already in stock. You might inherit specific contracts with vendors to distribute the goods, so on and so forth. But you're not buying every asset of the company. The company's free to continue on. Obviously, you want to have obligations on behalf of the selling company not to continue to manufacture that product after you buy it. But this is all that's the stuff that's going to be negotiated in the contract. But again, I mean, in 90% of the cases, a buyer is going to want to do this structure, especially this is the only structure that really works if the selling entity plans to continue operating in some other capacity. So again, these are the two typical structures. Ken, would you mind switching to I think it's my last slide. Yes, liability mitigation strategy. So I would say the bulk of an M&A transaction, vast majority of it is dealing with liability resolution issues. The first one, the most common and easiest way to avoid liability, I tell people all the time, is to do a good job at due diligence in a transaction. Due diligence is a process where, if you've ever bought a house, for example, you sign a contract on day one, you have 30, 60 days, whatever you negotiate, to have inspections taken, to look at deeds and history of the property to make sure everything you're buying is up to snuff. It's sort of similar for a business, except much more comprehensive. In the typical due diligence process, you'll start by sending out a checklist or questionnaire to the seller. The seller's counsel will work with them to respond to it. And you'll ask for everything. I mean, it's very comprehensive. You'll ask about real estate related issues, employment related issues, litigation, debt, finances, insurance, data privacy. I mean, you'll ask for all contracts of the business. I mean, there's usually multiple pages of questions on basically every topic you can think of under the sun. Intellectual property is another big one. And so you'll get, sometimes, depending on the size and scope of the business and how long it's been operating, a massive online database that you have to go through and review everything. And as you can imagine, some of this is going to require legal review. Some of it's going to require CPA review. Some of this might require very specialized legal review. So a guy like Ken or Mark would be able to do a lot more detailed product safety analysis, depending on the business type, than I could. Likewise, I can't do any of the financial review because I'm not a CPA. So there's always going to be push and pull in having a large team involved to handle these transactions. From the seller's perspective, due diligence is important for the same reason. I mean, if I'm representing a seller, I have to constantly let them know you have to disclose as much as they're asking for and then more, because if you don't, you're going to get potentially sued for failure to disclose, and there can be liability for fraud if you are deemed to have willfully failed to disclose something. So it behooves everybody to be as open as possible during the due diligence process, and from the buyer's side, not to try to speed the process along and to try to get everything that's possible. And I've seen cases where this can take sometimes several months to go through what the sellers provide, but in a smaller deal, it might be a lot faster than that. I didn't include this specifically, but obviously another way to limit liability in these cases is by negotiating a strong written contract. A stock purchase or asset purchase agreement is it is always very buyer friendly. It'll contain a lot of provisions whereby the seller will have to make promises. They're called representations and warranties about the condition of the business, its assets, its liabilities, and so forth. Usually several dozen pages of these kinds of warranties. And so it's very important for the sides to craft those carefully. And if something's not accurate from the seller side, to disclose against it or try to carve back some of the language. That's probably the second most complicated process, is just negotiating the contract and the scopes and bounds. So the rest of the stuff that I'm mentioning here, most of it is related to the contract as well. So a limitation of liability is, I would say, within the contract itself, besides reps and warranties, one of the most heavily negotiated items. And this is usually to protect the seller. A limitation of liability will say effectively the seller won't be liable for certain types of conduct, or its liability will be capped. So it's pretty common in one of these contracts for the seller to ask that it only be liable for the direct damages that a buyer might suffer, and not any indirect damages, that it won't have responsibility for punitive damages, meaning damages that are trying to punish the seller, or excuse me, the buyer. No, I was right, the seller, for liabilities to the buyer. They'll also ask for caps on damage. And so a cap would be something that's usually expressed as a percentage of the purchase price. If you look at data reports for private M&A transactions, a common number is usually 10 to 15% of the purchase price. So if it's $1 million, the seller's liability would be capped at, let's say, 100, 150,000. Of course, buyer is going to want to negotiate against that, try to get the amounts higher, try to have carve outs to the caps in the event that there's fraud or a lie by the seller. All this stuff can be heavily negotiated. You might see deductibles or baskets on the caps and all kinds of things. So you could really get bogged down in these negotiations, especially in a bigger deal. Another concept that'll protect the buyer here is indemnification. I like to think of indemnification like you buy a business, you find out that there was a tax liability, the government sues you for the tax, then you go to the seller and say, pay the tax and cover my legal expenses in defending this. And by the way, hire me counsel to defend myself. So that's indemnification. Also heavily negotiated in a lot of these contracts. But from a buyer's perspective, like I said a few minutes ago, and like I always tell my clients, once you pay money to somebody, expect that it's just gone. They're, in the Bahamas, the money's never going to be there. So you can have all the indemnification provisions in the world. They're only as good as the paper they're written on if that money goes away. So you need to find other ways to protect yourself. And there are a few ways to do that. Number one is an escrow holdback. So the concept is fairly straightforward. Some portion of the purchase price is put into an escrow account at closing, and instead of being paid to the seller, is left in there for some negotiated period of time in the event that a liability arises. So, if it's $1 million purchase price, let's say $100,000 is left in escrow for a year or maybe 2 years in an extreme case, in the event some kind of liability arises. The amount is often negotiated based on expected liabilities. So, if there's an ongoing litigation where there's with an ex-employee who claims they were unfairly terminated, and the reasonable expectation is that they could get $80,000 in damages, well, you might ask for $100,000 to be left in there, $200,000 just in case that event comes to pass. Another common way to offset these risks is escrow holdback, seller notes with offset provisions. So in some deals, part of the purchase price is paid up front, part of the purchase price is paid over time, meaning like you have a $2 million deal, let's say $1.5 million is paid at the closing, and the buyer might agree to give the seller a promissory note and pay the other $500,000 over a 2-year period with, I don't know, 6% interest. And one way the buyer can protect itself is to say that it can offset any damages against its obligations under the note. There's other ways you can do this too. Sometimes buyers defer some part of the purchase price into what's called an earnout, meaning the seller's CEO or seller's stockholders stick around for some period post-closing to help with the business and get paid, effectively a success fee instead of adding that on the purchase price. And you can always offset against that too to protect liability, against liability-related issues. Finally, a common tool is representation of warranty insurance. This is insurance that usually will protect the buyer against sellers' problematic disclosures that turn out not to be true. It can be expensive, so it's not usually used in very small deals, but it's common in bigger and mid-sized deals. And effectively, in a representation of warranty policy, you might get some percentage of the purchase price covered, but again, you're dealing with insurance, so there's a lot of headaches there. But a savvy buyer will use some combination of a lot of these different tools to protect itself in the case of a non-disclosed issue or some sort of lawsuit that comes out of the woodworks. With that said, I want to turn it over to Ken since I've been talking for about 25 minutes and move on with the presentation.
Well, thank you. Mark, we're going to turn it over to you to give your personal experience. I do have an interesting question, but I'll talk about it when I get to my after Mark's done. So
Okay.
go ahead, Mark.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you, Griffin. Good stuff. So, again, I'm not a M&A attorney, so I'm not going to be able to speak to a lot of what Griffin did, but he's covered it really well. One thing I have had experience with over the years is being involved in mostly acquisitions. So our company's acquired a number of things. We were acquired at one point, and so we've had a number of these things. So one thing that I've noticed, and early on we weren't very good at it, was really participating in the due diligence stage with some of our product safety people. And in our company, early on, product safety, product liability kind of fell under the same umbrella. Some companies might have divergent, charts and how you do that. But at the end of the day, one of the things that we almost always forgot were the compliance people. And as you go back and double back, it's like, oh, there's some really good stuff there that if you don't spend some time with, you can open yourself up to some liabilities and risk going forward. And when I say compliance, I'm going to spend it more from the product safety professionals purview, and it would be more of the product compliance. So things like UL, government relations, government regulations, and things like that. One of the biggest challenges that I've found is if you buy a business and you're getting involved in that is you need to understand the product. And it's really a limited amount of time. Due diligence, you can have some time, but you don't have a ton of time to become super familiar. So having folks who are kind of tangentially assigned to this and like, yeah, it looks like they got a UL program. Yeah, it looks like they report, probably not enough. So spending a little time or adding to your due diligence team, someone from your compliance team, so someone who does this stuff for a living, probably someone at a manager level, never hurts. And one of the things that we like to look at are what are the products? What standards are we dealing with? If it's a standard that I've never heard of, are we prepared to deal with it? Do we even know how to deal with it? Are there government things that we have never heard about? And I've got an example I'll talk about in a second.
Frozen.
But government relations, our government regulations and things can also come with a reporting obligation. Do they have any? So understanding those and asking those questions is a big deal. Another thing is, are we getting the staff? Are part of the assets, are we getting people? Are we just buying names? Are we buying the brand product, or do we get the people? And if I'm adding a staff of 10 people, who are they? What do they know? Can they actually do the work that we need to do? And one thing that really is something to be careful with, at least in my opinion, is don't just assume because they've been in business a long time and that they're doing something that they're doing it correctly or they're doing it well. I think that's a really big thing. So get yourself involved, know what good looks like, and then compare that to a measuring stick that you believe to be appropriate. For example, we got involved with a team, a company that we were purchasing, and found out that all of the operators manuals that they created were actually created by product managers. Okay, great guys. They're business people. And they put all sorts of marketing wank in there and all sorts of stuff. But the key product safety stuff you'd normally expect to see wasn't that great. They spent more time on pictures and colors. So when you start coming into that, it's like, wow, now I've got to take that and we'll talk about claims and stuff a little later. But that's a real problem if you have to use that manual or some of those on product markings or things for your defense in a liability case. You don't have much to work with. And the people who developed them didn't have a very deep well with which to draw water from. So now you're kind of inheriting what they did. So understanding that goes a long way. Similarly with the compliance staff, if they're seasoned veterans and they know what they're doing and they know how to read standards, maybe they sit on a standards committee, really helpful. If they're people who send everything to UL and UL just, or some third party lab, and they just do the work and send them a letter back, that could be tough because they might not have a lot of insight into the design of the product. They might not even have influence into designing compliance into the product. So now you're fully reliant on a third party lab. And then that comes to that next point. Who is that lab? I've mentioned UL a number of times because they're familiar to everybody. And so it wouldn't surprise me if many product manufacturers use UL to gain certification, but they're not the only one. You know, there are NRTLs that OSHA has listed in their sheet, plenty of them. Not all are equal. Not all have the same capabilities in all categories. So again, knowing your product, knowing what you're getting into, and understanding that third-party lab's ability to actually provide certification at a high level becomes very important to you. At least I believe it does. Because there again, I'm going in expecting compliant product, and I find out that, well, the lab that they chose is good people, they're nice folks, but they really didn't know the product very well, made a poor interpretation, and now we've got a problem. So those things become really big deals. And I think it's stuff that we don't spend as much time as we could in the due diligence phase. And I think it matters. One thing that we do here is we participate in lab programs. So we go to our third party labs and get involved in their data acceptance programs. We have ISO certification in our labs. Do those folks do that? What type of work do they do in house? So do they test their own? Do they send it outside? Do they contract people? So how much can you learn from what they can do? And how much capability are you buying? How much are you getting into? So is it really an asset or is it going to be now part of something you have to do? And now that you get to where you have to do it, it's like, well, what happens if you don't know how? Now you're signing up for a whole new thing that adds a new set of liability. And depending on how you put the contract together and what you're buying and what you're responsible for, you could end up owning a whole bunch of responsibility that you're not really able to manage. You know, an example I think we could all probably get our arms around is this kind of conversion of gas engine products to batteries. If you make a battery product, you're probably deeply familiar with batteries. You know how to do work and not make them blow up and turn on fire, and you get to do all sorts of fancy things. And that's really good work, and it takes a lot of energy and a lot of smarts to do it. Go take a gas engine product now. Go buy an outdoor power equipment company and bring in a lawnmower. Gas engines have emission controls. They have evaporative emissions. They have all sorts of stuff you know nothing about. You have to go to the EPA and probably California Air Resources Board. You have reporting obligations. You have federal standards that you have on top of your UL standards that you had nothing to do with in the past and you don't know how to deal with. But those all became your problem really quickly. So understanding that becomes a really important piece of that transaction, because if you need to either work with this to either say, yeah, I do need the people, I do need the assets, or we're buying some risk here, that could become part of that negotiation on the risk side because you don't know what you're getting into. And that could be a thing that you might have, and it might even be worth a pause and have the company say, I need more information. You know, and it does dovetail into risk. And it dovetails neatly, I think, into risk, especially from the standpoint of, you know, if you're going to buy full liability of what's going on out there. You know, somebody sticks their finger in a drill, it's going to hurt. They might get stitches. They stick their finger in a lawnmower, they're probably losing fingers. You get a much different problem. We don't throw material across the room with a drill, but lawnmowers do. We had a case here in Milwaukee or the Wisconsin area where a kid at a playground got hit in the head and got a traumatic brain injury by a rock thrown by a rotting lawnmower. It was a landscape company working nearby, but it threw out of that machine and hit a kid. And I don't know if the person who owns that company is expecting to hit kids with lawnmower, but you should very well expect thrown objects are going to be a problem. Broken windows, hitting animals, hitting people, damaging property, all things you should be aware of. And if you just bought the lawnmower company and are oblivious to that, you have no idea the types of risk you're buying. So understanding the claims history from that company might give you a lot of insight. So asking for what you can find out.
Mark,
Yeah,
Mark, can I ask a question?
of course.
Do you ever get involved before the due diligence process? Due diligence is not, I guess, a legal, well, it is a legal concept in that you've entered into an acquisition agreement and there are various requirements of divulging information and confidentiality provisions. Do you ever get involved when an executive comes to you and says, we're thinking about buying this business? Is this a good idea? Do you get in, and Griffen, I'll call that pre-due diligence. Just, it's just, we don't have an agreement with them, but we're thinking about buying them. Do you ever get involved at that point?
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's a great point because one of the things that makes a big deal is what are you getting yourself into? And obviously we get into these relationships to try to make money, right? You're buying a business to try to make a product, to make a profit and sell something and do something. But if you find out that you've just bought or you're looking to buy a pile of liability that you don't have any understanding of, or you don't know what you're about to get into, that could be enough to say, let's not even get into the negotiation. Let's not even go into that area because we're asking for it. Another part, and this is the other half of that coin, though, Ken, and I think it's a great question, is that might also be part of the decision to buy a company. If it's a make versus buy type thing, it's like, I don't know how to make that. I don't know how to control it in manufacturing. I don't know how to handle suppliers. I don't know what goes into that. But if I find the right person who does, that might be the better thing. As acquiring a business who knows that, has that intelligence, might be the better business call. So now you can expand your portfolio and you can do it responsibly and in a reasonable way by hooking up with a really good acquisition or a merger. But those things become a better business decision you can have on the front end before you even get into the details. So you bet. But as we get into these details, another thing that I really like to understand is it's like recalls. I mean, those are simple in a sense. You can go out and search CPSC or Health Canada, and you can go do research on guidelines and recalls. But really getting to the root cause of why and what did you do can teach you a lot about how that company performs and how they're used to things and what, again, if you're buying people, or not buying, but if your people are coming, if you're getting staffing with part of those assets, it'll give you some insight on what you're getting into. Settlements and stuff, obviously, trials, you go into a lot of detail on that. But one thing that I ask for, and we try to get enough data for, is to see is how do we distill this down to kind of claims as a percentage of sales. How much are you dealing with as a percentage of sales for the company? So if you're making so many product, and you're making so much money, but you're spending a pile of it because you're sloppy and you're loose, that's a big deal compared to whatever you might expect that you're doing at your own company. It might also show that you've just got a very high risk product. And so when you look at it, can you actually manage that high risk product in a reasonable way? I don't know, but that's part of the discussion you're going to want to have and understand those things. Because at the end of the day, that could become part of the price negotiations as far as I see it. If you're buying a lot of liability, if you're buying a lot of future risk, then you probably are going to want to make sure that you're insulating yourself against some of that to the extent you can and see what you can do to influence that or include contract language that helps you to make sure that you're protecting yourself kind of the way Griffen was talking about, whether it be through limits of liability or indemnifications or what have you. We actually had a case, we were sold. And one of the negotiations that we had was we were sold, but the company that sold us had a ton of asbestos and silica exposure. And the new company was actually able to negotiate in that there was a sliding scale on how much the new company was responsible for that exposure. So for the first couple of years, it was all back on the selling company. And then at year 2, it started to be a little less. And by years 5 or 6, it had all converted to the new company. But anything they knew and anything that came in, there was a very well articulated table of who owned what for some of those claims. But they were so ubiquitous in that industry, everybody knew you were going to get another silica or asbestos claim. It was a matter of time. So understanding that was a negotiating point that we were able to be part of and help set the table for what we have responsibility for, but also what type of money transactions were going to be affected by that. Another thing that's really helpful is to have somebody familiar with these industries to look at industry trends. Government regulations. Who wouldn't have liked to know about opioid lawsuits before they bought an opioid company? It's like that would have been really handy information. Well, if that's really what's happening, is they're all getting hammered, don't go getting into that business, even if it's dirt cheap. PFAS could be another thing there, where if there's a lot of stuff where there's exposure to PFAS and everyone's going after it, and there's companies that made waterproof clothing, waterproof this and that, yeah, you're probably going to end up running into some PFAS questions. So understanding that might not be a bad idea, because that's a trend you're going to have to manage through. Again, we talked about asbestos and silica. Batteries. Batteries are a big deal from a safety side. Everybody knows that. But what they may not know is there are 26 states that are looking at battery EPR, or extended producer responsibility bills, which means you're going to have to go have a program and a provider and a collector to pick up your garbage in 26 states. So who's going to go pick up all your garbage, and you have to pay for that? So are you prepared for that? Do you have relationships? Does the current company have relationships that you can leverage? So it's like a lease. Can I sign on to that contract, or do I have to make a new one? I don't know, but it'll be really, really helpful to understand some of that. Vendor agreements are another thing we spend some time with, and looking at what indemnification we have with their vendors. So what are, if we're going to stay with that same vendor book and the same group of people, what are we getting into? And is it worth the paper it's written on? What insurance coverages do we have through vendors or through purchase supply agreements, if any? And do you actually have access to that money if something does go badly? So understanding that, or are you on your own? And to a great extent, at some points we kind of predict that we're going to be on our own for quite a bit. Does it make sense? And then we'll go see if we actually do have some coverage that'll make us feel better about things. But especially when you're using out of country or offshore vendors, you just don't know. And that comes with product quality and the whole bit. One of the things I've seen a lot of the supplier agreements, especially with smaller companies, that they don't include are things like recall protection. So if you had a product recall, they all have the standard boilerplate stuff, workmanship and all this stuff. But what about recalls and definitions of product defect, and how do you actually define those things in those agreements? And folks who deal with claims and deal with safety will help you understand what that is. If you're a sophisticated company, you likely already have that built into your agreements, and you can look at those and assess whether or not you're getting like coverage, or you're getting a little bit of exposure here. So it's a big deal. Then, kind of the last thing I know I spend a lot of time with is user base. Who do you sell to? Where do you sell? Are you big box retail? Are you through distribution networks? Are you online? What type of folks are buying your product? What are they doing with it? How are you advertising it? That becomes kind of an important thing, because most companies have a lot of things that they do with going after, their target audiences. Are you getting a new target audience? Is it complementary to what you already do? Could it be a little conflicting to what you do? Could you end up into a place where you don't know a lot about it? Do you have a lot of low information folks, a lot of high information folks? So are you making a professional product versus a consumer? All things that you're going to have to kind of think about. And so as we go through these processes, having our safety professional or safety professionals who know how to look at compliance and risk and government trends and government affairs, that all becomes a really big deal for us. And it's something that I would suggest is an important piece of what we're doing here. I think that's, I guess that's kind of what I've got, Ken, from a prepared stand and stuff.
All right, very good. Okay, well, let me jump in here then. And let me ask a question to Griffen first. Griffin, a company's thinking about buying a business, but they haven't made a decision. Can you get an agreement, or would it be appropriate then to enter into an agreement with the company to be acquired for the transfer of information under confidentiality provisions that would precede your decision as to whether you actually want to buy them?
Not just is it a good idea. I mean, you have to do that, right? So the first step in any of these deals is signing what's called a non-disclosure agreement, because if you're the seller, for example, and you're going to let the buyer look around, so to speak, the business, any confidential information you might have, you might have just blown the legal protections of confidentiality have you not signed a confidentiality agreement. So non-disclosure agreement is usually the first step in the process in almost any business. And then the next step will be, some sort of non-binding letter of intent that lays out the deal terms just at a high level that, of course, the parties are free to modify, but, kind of gives you the background of the deal. But I would, unequivocally recommend to my clients that you start the process off with the non-disclosure agreement. And yeah, I just want to make sure I'm answering the question exactly
Yeah.
correctly, Ken. Yeah.
Okay. So the due diligence process is not just once you enter into a contract with the company. There's a lot that's going on beforehand. And one of the messages of today is product safety professionals have an important role, usually underutilized, of helping the company decide whether to buy a business. And we'll talk about selling in a second. And now I have done over the years, I have done a number of audits of companies on behalf of their insurance company. So this is not an acquisition. This is they wanted to do what's called a loss control audit. So, but it's very similar to the kind of audit or due diligence that you can do on a company you're considering acquiring. And these are the kinds of things that I look at when I'm doing an audit for an insurance company. And you can determine a lot very quickly. Usually, I can look at the warnings and instructions and the marketing and some of the contracts. Of course, talk about their litigation and recalls, and get a pretty darn good idea of whether we even want to insure this company, which is really the process with the insurance company, or not. Similarly, do you really want to buy a company? Now, when I was an in-house lawyer at Emerson Electric, I was in charge of product liability. At any given time, we owned about 140 businesses, and periodically, not often enough, I would look at the litigation that was involved with the company to be acquired. It was real easy to figure out whether you want to do this or not just based on the litigation. So a lot of these things are pretty easy to do. So the due diligence process, which sometimes is a fairly short period of time, you can still do a lot of good analysis. I think, and I can only speak to my experience, I don't know in general, but the product safety professionals maybe are too busy doing their other things to get involved in this. But I strongly encourage companies to encourage their product safety people and to involve them in this process, because they can pretty quickly give you a pretty good sense, at least a sense of whether you even want to consider acquiring the company. Once you decide you want to acquire it, or you have the letter of intent, as Griffin says, then you can get into more detail on some of these things. And you've got to figure out what they all mean, but it'll help the deal guys structure what kind of mitigation provisions that Griffin was talking about are important or not. The holdbacks and certainly one of the big issues from an acquisition standpoint, of course, is going to be the future liability for products that were sold by the company to be acquired, and who's responsible for them, and how are these cases defended. One thing I didn't put in on this list, and that is the insurance. Mark, you mentioned that. So what kind of insurance does the company to be acquired have? And does that travel with the purchase, or is your insurance company going to have to then jump in at that point? So you might even need to involve your insurance company to help evaluate the company to be acquired to try to determine whether they would even cover it. There are a lot of product lines that insurance companies just they won't cover. So if you go out off on a new product area that you're not in currently, the insurance company may say, "I'm sorry, we don't insure for that." So that'll have an effect on the business and what you want to do. So these are the kinds of things, and this is now the safety audit from the buyer of the selling company. That's what this is. Now, on the other side, and I will be posting an article that I wrote on this subject, and it talks in more in detail about this, but just briefly. Um, Even when you're selling a business to another company, there are a bunch of very interesting issues, and Griffen, you talked just a little bit about that. Certainly, the liability issue is the big one. But the one that I had as a as an in-house lawyer was defending the lawsuits and how are we going to do that. So if we sold either assets or the business, uh, and we maintained liability for products we had already sold, how am I going to defend those products? I'm selling assets, so I'm selling the business, which includes the documents and the personnel, but I'm going to be responsible to defend lawsuits over products that I sold as the selling company. Well, how am I going to do that? Is the acquiring company going to provide their personnel to help defend the case? Are they going to provide documents? Uh, who gets to decide whether we're going to try the case or settle the case? Um, you can see one of the problems here is that, for example, I'm selling my business. I'm responsible for the product liability cases of the products that I sold originally. And I go out and I try a lawsuit and I get hit with a big verdict. Well, I'm responsible for that, but the acquiring company is going to have to live with the plaintiff's verdict against their product, basically. So that's going to hurt them going forward. So how the cases are settled, how the cases are defended, are very important for both the buyer and the seller, and assuming that the seller is still in business. So how that's structured is really got to be part of the deal. So not only product safety professionals should be involved in the process, but also the litigation counsel for both sides ought to be participating and decide how this is going to work. Because you can really get yourself in a pickle trying to defend lawsuits that you have no ability to defend because you didn't really think about it during this process. The other thing is post-acquisition product changes. So a company buys assets and then they leave the product liability with the seller for the products that they sold, which is, I think, probably Griffen, I think that's typical. Would you say that's typical, is that when a selling company, which is still in business, they keep the liability for product liability involving products they've sold? Would they say that's typical?
I mean, I say nothing's really typical in these kinds of deals because everything's negotiable, but I would defer to you on that specific point. But I mean, these are the kinds of things that get heavily negotiated, right? And I would say one thing that would affect that is the history of claims that have happened in the past. From the buyer's perspective, if there's a lot of claims that have been asserted against the selling company in the past, obviously there's a higher risk in the future. So I'm as buyer's counsel going to try to negotiate that the seller keeps everything. Of course, seller's counsel is going to say, I don't want to keep any of this. So you end up somewhere in the middle. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
Yeah. Well, anyway,
it's important, Griffin, because that's kind of what happens with some of the toxic torch stuff that we've seen. It's like they know it's coming, it's going to be out there, and so one, to Ken's point, can we defend it? And secondly, do you have everything? And who's going to make the call? We're a very proud brand. We like to defend a brand. Not everybody's as risk is at risk averse. They would want to do more. So how do you get to control how your brand is being litigated? And how do you get to be part of that? Because that could be a really big deal that you get inadvertently harmed by because you didn't negotiate that well in the front end, and now you're kind of stuck with someone else's decision.
Right, right. But on the post-acquisition product changes, so somebody buys the assets and they decide that the product has a defect or that it's just not safe enough, and they want to make a significant safety improvement in the product. And the seller is keeps the product liability litigation over their products. Well, I mean, that will be used by a plaintiff's lawyer as an admission that your earlier product was defective. So is that acceptable to the selling company? So these kinds of things, you can't think about them after the deal's done. You got to think about them beforehand. And again, product safety professionals and those who are doing the litigation need to be involved earlier on in the process than when it's done. And then the last one on there are recalls and reports to the government. Um, who who gets to decide on that? Again, we're talking. We'll assume I'm keeping the liability over products I sold, so I, as the seller, may have a responsibility to report to the government, the CPSC, and recall the product. Do I have to get permission from the buying company to do that? Because that affects their product too. So how this is divided up, and again, in my narrow experience, very narrow experience on this, nobody really talks about those things. It's just
Well,
not
and that's
something
funny you
that
bring it.
comes
David
up.
had a question in the chat exactly to that. If companies acquiring a company and then through due diligence learns that they got a problem that probably should have been reported, what do we do? You're in the middle of it. It's like, that's a heck of a question.
Right, right.
Well, I'll say
Well,
one thing is that the government does not care about, I mean, they're not going to reset the clock for you on your timing obligations just because you walked into the shoe. I mean, the company, if it had let's say 90 days to report something, and I don't know the specific time here, but they're not going to give the new buyer an extra 90 days just because they're the new buyer. I've had plenty of cases where my client buys a business and then we find out something hasn't been properly reported. And I mean, the best course of conduct in most cases is to go to the agency and say, hey, we're making this report in good faith. We bought the business and everything like that. And a lot of times the government will be okay with that, depending on the agency and depending on the situation. But they're certainly not going to just say, oh, you bought the business, so we're wiping the slate clean. I mean, that's not that's something buyers need to just be aware of.
Yeah,
right.
and we've been through that here. One of our sister companies did exactly that. They did not do a very good job in due diligence looking at claims, and it turned out that a lot of the old companies' complaint files were actually stuff that was like, oh no, this is a problem. And so when we found out after the fact, they got a bunch of us together. No, we went proactively, thinking we were proactive to CPSC to say, yeah, we just bought this thing and here's what we're doing. And they said, well, great, thank you. And they hit us with a $6 million late reporting fine. And we spent the whole day at CPSC to get it down to under 4 million. But they're like, someone did it. There was bad action. It just, we did not, at least the sister company did not do the right work to learn that exposure. And they bought themselves a problem.
Well, and I served as an expert witness in a lawsuit for the seller where the buyer sued the seller because we didn't divulge the fact that they were going to have to recall the product about a month after the acquisition was completed. And my defense as the expert witness was, hey, there was enough documentation in the documents we provided you during the due diligence process to identify the potential that you would have to recall this product. So we did give you the information, you just missed it. That was our defense, which is a little uncomfortable, but that's what it is. So yeah, the information that's being provided during due diligence is very important. But again, my main message here is product safety professionals can provide a hugely important role, whether you're buying or selling. There are all kinds of tricky issues here, and it's something that you ought to encourage your companies to involve you in going forward. Anyway, I think we will end. Our time is up. I want to thank you all for attending. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Griffen, for participating. The got this last slide here. We will be putting the slides and one article at least on this subject on the website in our archive. and a link to this the video if you want others at your company to see this. So thank you all very much for being here today, and we look forward to seeing you at future webinars. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.